Thank you very much, Jenny, and for doing a wonderful job of publishing the volume and particularly allowing us extra latitude to include all the index entries and sub-entries that were vital. And thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for hosting this occasion today. It's extremely generous of the University of Sussex, and I know that I join Asa and Susan Briggs in being very grateful to you for putting on such a great show. My role is to lead a discussion which we hope will be a taster for you buying the heavily discounted copies of the book that are at the back of the room, and which the subject of the book is very willing to sign later in the day. And as Michael Farthing mentioned, there are also some copies of some of Asa's own autobiographical recollections there. This volume is not a work of biography. That will come. It is not a Festschrift. That has already been on the occasion of Asa's retirement, nor does it try to emulate or cover the same ground as in the very revealing 3 volumes of recollections that Asa has written since his 90th birthday in 2011. What we have tried to do in the book instead is to put, as the Vice-Chancellor has implied, his life into some kind of context. And in the discussion that ensues, we will be looking at 3 particular aspects of his career: his contribution to historiography, his contribution to the history of broadcasting, in particular the great biography of the BBC in 5 volumes, and also, and perhaps most appropriately for the occasion here today, his contribution in the establishment of the new universities, but also leadership in some of the civic and older universities as well. Before we begin, Asa is of course keen to say something himself, and then as we proceed we will draw him into the conversation. It'll be impossible to hold him back, don't worry. But I did say and promise to him that he could have the first go. So over to you, Asa.
Well, I'm delighted, Vice-Chancellor, that we're here in the University of Sussex to launch this book. And I'm very glad to be with 4 of the people who took part in the discussions a few years ago when I was 90. It's a book which is based on a coincidence. The Institute of Historical Research and I were 90 years old. And I like things to be based on coincidences. I'd also like to say that you have been a marvellous person to work with long after the meeting took place, because you put so much work into this book that it is really a triumph. I feel that I'm happy to be sitting with 4 of the people with whom I took part in discussions which were very frank and had none of the attributes of a Festschrift about them. It was a great occasion, and I know that some of you were there. 2 members of my family were there, Matthew and Daniel, and I'm delighted that they're here today because they were here on that other day when the meeting took place. And also, my daughter Catherine has come over, and my family do mean an awful lot to me. But Miles, this is really your day, and I'm prepared to follow whatever lines you suggest, as I did virtuously, I think, when we met at the Age of Asa.
That's your version of events. So what we thought we'd do is I would make some introductory framing comments, and then we would lead the discussion around those themes that are central to the book. We hope very much that there'll be some contributions from the audience as well, and we've got about 45 minutes or so set aside for all of that. So I hope that sounds like a good way to proceed. Let me tell you really about why the book is called The Age of Asa. It's not just the allure of alliteration, which comes with the title. It's not simply an allusion to one of Asa's most famous books, The Age of Improvement, but age signifies, I think, four aspects of Asa's career that we wanted to signal and discuss and analyse in the chapters in the book. The first is that it is the age since the end of the Second World War. There's a very famous book written by Noel Annan called Our Age, which is a portrait of that particular generation of intellectuals and public life. And if you look it up, you'll find a few references to Asa, but really not as many as there should be. And most of the references in that work refer to him having had the gall to leave Oxford and not make his career there. And really that signals something we're trying to do in the book, to say that there has been a massive contribution to intellectual and political life and to the life of higher education, which has come from outside Oxford and Cambridge, and indeed out from outside London. And Asa's self-identification as a provincial, in a very positive sense of the word, I think tells us a lot about that particular cohort of figures, which would include Richard Hoggart and Michael Young, and of course Asa himself, who had a marked impact on the history of this country, and particularly in public affairs in the 1950s and 1960s. Perhaps the best indication of that is the fact that Asa wrote the biography of the National Institution of National Life, which is the BBC. But it can also be seen in many other aspects of his career: his support for the arts, the British Film Institute, Glyndebourne, the Press Council, just to name a few. His role in the great moments of expansion in higher education, not just the civic universities, Leeds, not just the new universities like Sussex, but also the Open University, and part of his biography, about which more needs to be written, the Workers' Educational Association, of which he was president through the late 50s and early 60s, combining that role with all the other things he was doing at that time. The age also suggests endurance and longevity. And this is a man whose first prize-winning essay was published, or not published, but was submitted for the competition, which he won in 1939, on a topic, the East India Company's naval policy, which to some scholars' relief, he then didn't devote part of his career to studying. He chose to use that particular topic for others to pursue. That won a prize of the Royal Asiatic Society, and eventually I will track down the typescript. Asa's the first review of something by Asa comes in the Manchester Guardian in July 1946 in a programme that he had made for the northern section of the BBC on the Anti-Corn Law League. And the rest, of course, then flows. So many publications over so many years, 40 plus books, many edited volumes of writings by other scholars, but also collections of academic essays by scholars. Asa told the Times newspaper on his 90th birthday that he averaged about 1,500 words a day. Now, if you do the math, and math is not my strong point, that's 30 million words across a lifetime of writing and publishing. Not for nothing is the subtitle of his History of Longmans called Longevity in Publishing, which not only describes that particular organisation, but of course his own life's output. 30 million words. Encyclopaedia Britannica, which of course Asa himself edited in the 1970s, was involved in its editorial, has 44 million words. So you've still got 14 million to go, Asa. So don't put down the pen just yet. And what wonderful works they are. We've got some of the main books and editions listed in the bibliography to this volume, but there will be an accompanying online bibliography courtesy of the Institute website once the compilation team, i.e. me, have completed that mammoth expertise. And I think I want to say particularly that something that is often forgotten about Asa is just what a persistent and great reviewer he has been. In so many of the mainstream academic journals and broadsheet newspapers and magazines of the last 40 or 50 years. His first review in the English Historical Review, probably the academic journal he's contributed most, was in 1954, and the last one so far was in 2005. That just gives you a sense. I should say that the last review he did in the English Historical Review was of a book edited by me called The Victorians Since 1901. So there's a nice little coincidence, if you like, there. But there have been many, many reviews in The Guardian, The Observer, New Statesman, New Society, New Scientist, Scientific American, The Times Literary Supplement, and so on and so forth. And I think within those reviews, and I think Martin Hewitt's chapter does this particularly well in the volume, you can also write a narrative about Asa's own approach to history. Now, thirdly, age, in historical terms, also refers to a chronological period. And I think that is entirely fitting when we think of Asa's distinct contribution to historiography. It is hard to imagine Victorian studies looking anything like they have become in the last 20 or 30 years, but for Asa's great work through the late 1940s through to the mid-1960s, and then a return to the area with his great book Victorian Things. Victorian people, Victorian cities, and Victorian things amount to the best introduction to the Victorian period, and it's really hard to know what we would have done without those great pieces of work. And of course, in a typical fashion, Asa's own work on Victorian studies in the 1950s was partly shaped by his environment, and working in Leeds, which still bore all the local indications of being a Victorian city, was, I think, an extremely important part of that creative process. But of course, if we dwell on Asa as the eminent historian of the Victorian period, we are in danger of saying less about his other contributions to historiography, to oral history, to the history of media and communications, to the history of business and retailing, to urban history, to the history of technology. And one thing that I think came through my own research for this volume is his contribution to a subject like the history of music, about which he's written in different ways on different occasions. And then fourthly and finally, the concept of age refers to beginnings and endings, to turning points, to the randomness and yet underlying patterns in history, and the understanding of which Asa is a particular master. Now, of course, Asa has no ending, and it's very interesting to find out about his beginnings. He's extremely interested in those watershed moments. One of his great edited books, and the co-editor is here today, is Fin de siècle, on how centuries end, and he has a particular line of argument about the pivotal importance of the 1890s, for example. But as much as Asa looks backwards and is of course the preeminent historian of modern Britain in so many ways, he is also one who likes to look into the future. When he retired as Provost of Worcester College in Oxford, he gave an interview to the Oxford Alumni magazine, and there's a quote in there which I've found very instructive, and we may want to ponder on it, and we may want to ask Asa to do some crystal ball gazing. But he said, "We have to prove through education that we are capable of looking into the future." And I think that's an enormously fitting thing to say on one's retirement, and I may ask you to look into the future and give us some guidance. But anyway, enough of those framing points. Let us now turn to some deeper discussion of the book. As I say, the book covers three main themes. As David Cannadine notes in his preface, the original conference and the book could have covered many more themes. I particularly would have liked a chapter called Lord Briggs of Heathrow to, in a way, write about Asa's amazing cosmopolitanism and internationalism. I think that sense of the galloping Don was partly admiration, partly jealousy, but it really did sum up so much of the overseas work that Asa did throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And I know that Susan and the family sometimes bore the brunt of that and was sometimes swept up in the jet stream that went with it as well. But for example, in the 1950s alone, Asa was publishing and writing in Italian and in French. He travelled to India, he travelled to Poland, he travelled to the USA on several occasions, and of course saw out the decade with a memorable spell in Australia, which we have a chapter on. The other chapter I would have liked in the book, don't worry Jenny, there's no volume 2 planned, would have been on Asa as a biographer. I think he's a wonderful biographer. I think Victorian People shows how you do biographical studies that also have something to say about the life of the times as well as the life of the particular individual. If you look at some of his reviews, he has reviewed virtually every volume written on Churchill since the 1960s, in particular the Martin Gilbert series. He's reviewed virtually every volume of the Gladstone Diaries, and he has reviewed many other multi-volume editions of people's lives. And if you put all those reviews together, you've probably got some more books. I can see you're rising to the challenge of that. But anyway, the book is as it is, and I'm delighted that 3 of the contributors are here on the platform today. Professor Martin Hewitt is also in the audience, so please feel free to chip in and say, I didn't say that, or I meant to say that, if you wish. And so our 3 contributors from the original conference from the book, going from right to left, Dr. James Thompson from the University of Bristol, Professor Rohan McWilliam, a graduate of this fine university, who's now at Anglia Ruskin University, myself, Professor David Vincent, Professor of Social History at the Open University, about which there is a wonderful chapter in the book, and a face that will be familiar to many of you in the room, completing the panel today, Professor Matthew Crago, who is now at the University of Lincoln, where he is chair, dean, top man for the arts. Yes, all of those. But in his own right, as are many of us on this panel, a distinguished historian of 19th century Britain and in particular Wales. So that's us, and what I'm going to do is feed a question which the panel will mull over, and Asa, you must feel free to come in at any point. I think we'll have a bit of discussion here, and once you all feel sufficiently warmed up, we'll throw it out for discussion from the audience as well. So let us begin with Asa's contribution to the study of history, although trained as an economist, and of course Asa did 2 degrees at the same time. Whilst reading history at Cambridge, he was also doing economics at the LSE, which was during the war relocated to Cambridge. But anyway, Asa's most enduring legacy has been in the study of history. But which part of history? Rohan, can I ask you, what do you think has been Asa's most important impact in terms of the study and writing of history?
Well, I mean, answering that actually makes me want to go into Frank Capra, It's a Wonderful Life mode, actually. In other words, what would have happened if Asa Briggs had never been? And answer it realistically, and of course we would have had the rise of social history. I think the history of the Victorians would have come on stream. And yet, if you think about the historical landscape of the last half century, it is absolutely inconceivable without Asa Briggs. No scholar has been as fertile, not just in generating history, but in generating sub-disciplines of history, and generating research areas that other people, including people in this room, have gone on to research. I should also say I'm speaking here with a number of hats here. Obviously, lifetime admirer of Asa Briggs, contributor to this volume, proud Sussex University student, but also as president of the British Association for Victorian Studies. And it's great to be able to come here and actually salute our leading Victorianist. What I think is important about Asa Briggs is that he's always been ahead of the game in terms of historical research. He's generated questions, but then he's also, I think, challenged the prevailing historiography. We associate him, amongst many other things, with the development of labour history. And yet what is also interesting about his oeuvre is that he was one of those historians who realised right from the word go that you've got to write about capital and labour. That genuine social history has got to be about social relationships rather than internalist studies of any one social group. He was one of the first people to be writing seriously about retail, to realise that workers are not simply producers, although they are, but they are also consumers as well. And I think on an occasion like this, we can look back on the last 50 years or so of research, as we do quite properly in this book. But what strikes me now about Asa's contribution is how relevant it is to what is happening in the historical field as we speak. His great and enduring legacy, I think, is interdisciplinarity. And one of the things I'm really proud of as president of BAVS is that it's an organisation that is committed to the idea that there are no frontiers in the map of learning, that we can only understand about the Victorians in interdisciplinary ways by creating conversations between different subject groups. And who taught us that? So I'd like to think we are a Briggsian organisation. But also, if you think about the other things that are going on at the moment, one of the key areas of inquiry is the history of material culture. Think about objects and the history of objects and their appropriations and their uses. And of course, in that sense, we're just following in the slipstream of Victorian things.
Thank you. In those comments, Rohan refers to a couple of points we might want to think about in the questions. That phrase, the map of learning, which of course became the textbook, if you like, for thinking about interdisciplinary curricula in the new universities. And Rohan also alludes to the tremendous interest Asa has in literature and a broad definition of the arts. One thinks of all those editions of Trollope, of Thackeray, of Mayhew, of the Victorian, I hesitate to use the word canon, but that gives you some sense of reclaiming a lot of those writers in their own context. Can I stay on the theme of historiography and turn to you, David? Because you, of course, did your PhD at Cambridge in the 1970s, at the moment when the legacy and impact of Asa's work was probably at its height. I once did a calculation which showed that over 50% of all PhDs being done in Britain in the mid-1970s were being done on 19th century history. That day is gone, I'm afraid. Everyone does 20th century history, and the early modern has endured a renaissance. But in the 1970s, if you're a serious historian, and I think we all came in on the back of this in the 1980s, you worked on the 19th century. And that had a great deal to do with Asa's influence. But can you cast some reflections?
Well, you did, and when I left Cambridge to start my career in academic life, it was to an appointment as lecturer in Victorian Studies at University of Kiel, which had then a very flourishing interdisciplinary masters, and it seemed like the natural home for me. I think as some of the essays in the volume make clear, at that point, there were really two poles of energy in the intellectual life of the profession. One was Asa and the other was E.P. Thompson. And I think between them, they framed the questions that were being asked of the 19th century and set up the debate which ran on to this day as to how far we should concentrate on class and its outcomes in that period, or how far we should take a more diffuse interest in other sources of energy in the period. But it was the sense not only of listening much more closely to ordinary people, which connected Asa and E.P. Thompson and my own work, and also the relaxed engagement with disciplinary boundaries. At Keele, the degree was equally intellectual history, literature, and history, and we put our students across the whole front and taught across the whole front in a way which a generation earlier would have been absolutely inconceivable. The problem with Asa is that you can argue for his intellectual inspiration, but in the end we're kind of mini-me's. We were all trying to be Asa, and we're doing so on a small scale. But it was that openness to the whole of society in that period and to all the disciplinary approaches to it, which I think was most energizing at that point.
David, can I pick up on one other point, which I think you're peculiarly well placed to respond to, which is Asa's contribution to what's now called life writing, oral history, the other ways in which historians can gather testimony about people beyond the printed word. Asa, with Paul Thompson of the University of Essex, was very involved in the setting up of the National Sound Story Collection at the British Library. And of course there are people here in the audience today, including Professor Sir Brian Harrison, who know a great deal about Asa's contribution as a historian of different kinds of sources, in that case oral history for political historians. But could you reflect a little bit on that aspect of his work?
I think it was, well, I make 2 points. The first is that Asa, as in this case with Paul Thompson, is not only an academic with views about how history should be taught and researched, but he's an organizer and a maker of things. The Oral History Archive at Essex is an object, it's an event, and it's been a resource and will be a resource for historians past and in the future. The working class autobiography, bibliography that I put together with John Burnett and David Mail, again, under the inspiration of Asa, has become a resource for research going forwards. And it's the capacity of Asa, by his example and by his encouragement and by his intervention, not merely to point out how much can be learnt from this section of writing, but also to make possible others to follow in his footsteps, which has been so valuable. The other aspect of it is a methodology, is how actually you deal with this kind of literature, which means thinking about that evidence as a form of communication and trying to understand what's going on in terms of the conventions and the language and the structures which have generated that evidence. And is in his later work, not just on life histories, but also on publishing, on Longmans, which has been referred to, and on book history, which is in the in the collection, has been equally interested in the process by which people communicated with each other in the past, which is a necessary discipline if we're to understand how to use the particular artifacts within those modes of communication. So it runs from the life histories through to the history of publishing, through more broadly to the history of communication, which was done with Peter Burke. It's all of a part.
That's a very nice cue. We didn't rehearse this beforehand. For thinking about Asa's contribution to the history of communications and media, at the centre of which lies this massive project, the history of the BBC. Asa was commissioned by the BBC, well, by Oxford University Press and the BBC, to what was originally planned, I think, as a 3-volume work on the history of broadcasting, and then no number of volumes, yes, no specified. But I don't think they envisaged 5, and of course there are subsequent volumes now underway. The latest will be by Jean Seaton. It's been held up by the BBC lawyers for reasons that we don't need to detain us, but that is due out early next year. But those volumes between the early 1960s and 1995, the 5 volumes of the history of the BBC, I think are interesting in 2 ways. Firstly, they made the history of broadcasting and the history of communications, they helped make it a serious topic, not just in this country, but overseas in the USA and other countries as well. And secondly, and I think Asa has said this himself, it made Asa more of a social historian. We think nowadays very much that Asa has always had a leading contribution to social history, but if you look at his own statements about method in the 1950s before the great work on the BBC, he tends to see himself as more of an economic historian or a historian who brings in concepts particularly from sociology and the study of cities, I think something that was hugely influenced by his time in the USA. But it's the history of the BBC, the biography of the BBC, that I think turns him into much more of a social historian. And I wondered, James Thompson, whether we could ask you to lead us on reflecting on that part of Asa's work. Where does it sit within his own outputs, the history of the BBC, bearing in mind that he was doing 10,000 other things at the same time, including running this great university? And where does it sit in the history of broadcasting and of the history of communications as it subsequently developed?
Well, I think it has an absolutely clearly foundational place in the history of broadcasting and remains an extraordinary achievement, I think an extraordinary literary achievement in simply stringing the story together in such a compelling way, covering so much and digesting so much complexity. It remains absolutely essential in understanding the BBC as an institution and with it the history of broadcasting. So I don't think it's possible really to overstate its importance in that field. I try to suggest in my own chapter that in the volume that Asa has also brought a broader interest in communications within which we can sit that work on the BBC, notably in work he did on period before the emergence of the BBC in the 1890s through to the 1920s. We showed a real interest in technology and in communications more broadly and in what is often now called information or control revolution. So in a sense, ambitious as the history of the BBC is, I think the underlying project is more ambitious still, and it's actually part of that enormously bold vision of how to write the history of communications. It's a set of volumes that I'm very fond of, but partly as a historian of the media, but also I suppose as a child of the BBC. My father worked his pretty much his whole life in the BBC, and when he clocked up enough years of service, asked for copies of the Briggs volumes as his gift from the BBC. And I relate to them both as a historian, but also in a different kind of way, since I grew up on anecdotes of what people had said at programme review, which gives me perhaps an unusual take on them. But I think that it's that combination of the intimacy and the way that he evokes the people, and the clarity of the thinking about administrative structures, which gives it some of its enormous success as an institutional biography. Yet that also has to be seen in this much broader and bolder intellectual vision, I think, of a history of communications, of control, and of information. So I think those will be some aspects of its legacy.
David, just to call you in again in your sweeper role, of course you're a noted historian of secrecy and the information state. How revealing is Briggs on the BBC? Is there more that couldn't be told?
Not quite enough, I think, is the answer. And I'm sure that if he felt free, there was more that Asa could say. I mean, it goes back, of course, to your time at Bletchley Park and your direct knowledge then of the government's communication and propaganda policy in Europe, and then how that unfolded after the war. There is a sense in the post-war BBC volume of the gap between the rhetoric of the BBC, its self-constructed image that it was entirely free of government control, and the reality, particularly with the World Service, that there was in fact a great deal of intervention. And that's set out to give historians the kind of agenda to pursue further, but within the volume, for very obvious reasons, the detail of the interactions between the BBC and government, particularly during the war and in the Cold War, cannot be spelled out in quite as much detail as the historian would like it.
Can
to
we
be.
put you on the spot there, Asa? Did you feel confined?
No, I never felt confined, but I was always clear what an odd institution the BBC is. And that has been shown time and time again. I've always thought that universities are odd institutions, but the BBC is just as odd. I would also just like to say that I'm sad that Jane Seaton is not here today, but she's out in lecturing in some remote part of the world.
Pakistan.
Yes, Pakistan. She asked me if I would write an introduction to her own history, and of course I said yes. And she would like to have been here today, I know. Perhaps I'd just like to add one thing. I didn't realize when we had our great meeting when I was 90 and the Institute was 90, that there was one other institution in this country which is the same age, PhDs. The first PhDs came in the year when I was born. And if I had wanted to develop my academic career when I first started it, I would have regarded, it would have been regarded as being inferior if I had had a PhD. There was genuinely a feeling that if you were a good scholar, you didn't need a PhD. And now, of course, there's been a bigger change in that respect than in almost anything in my own lifetime.
So Asa and I didn't rehearse, or we did rehearse, but we didn't rehearse this segue, but that brings us neatly to, to Asa's contribution to universities, because it's a striking aspect of his career that not only has he presided over universities where there's been a very strong undergraduate component to his responsibilities, but that postgraduate research has forged ahead. And indeed, I think it's the case, Matthew, that at Sussex, the expansion of postgraduate numbers in the 1960s was well beyond what anybody imagined. But we'll come to that. Let me just say that Asa is associated most with the new universities, and I include in that the open universities. But of course, he started his career in Oxbridge, and indeed he reminds us that it was Thackeray who came up with that word, Oxbridge, and also spent a very important part of his career in a red brick university. And of course, Asa then told us where the word red brick came from in a very interesting review of a volume from the 1940s. But of course, here in Sussex, we particularly think of that enormously bold step he took, and if that sounds reminiscent of the lunar landings, then there you are, in coming to Sussex from Leeds via Australia. It wasn't a normal step for someone of his pedigree, if I may use that word, and generation to take. And I think and it's a point I make in the introduction, what is, I think, the real impact of Asa coming to Sussex is that he made the new universities academically respectable. That they became a place where leading academics of his generation could come and work and feel that this was doing their career a great deal of good. And he also helped create a university environment which was attractive to overseas students. And in Matthew's chapter again, there are instances of people specifically choosing Sussex as their UK university because of all that he managed to set about, surrounded by such a distinguished group, including the first Vice-Chancellor, John Fulton. So Matthew, can you lead us off by saying something about what was distinctive about Asa's contribution to the new universities, and in particular this university, and whether it's curriculum, is it campus design, is it attitude towards students? What would you say?
I would say interdisciplinarity again. Actually, I think that what Asa achieved was in this sort of 50s and early 60s was to create a sense that the new university project and interdisciplinarity as goals were both desirable on the one hand and doable on the other. And I think that actually you can map that rather neatly onto Asa's career in the 1950s and 1960s. And you might, when thinking about desirability, look at his years working with the University Grants Commission on the panel around new universities, and his trips to America and things like that, where he was imbibing new ideas. And then the second half, you might think more about his actual work here at Sussex and actually creating this university. I think that Asa is, I mean, I think in relation to the first half, Asa actually is a sort of conduit and a wonderful synthesizer of various intellectual trends which are sweeping through the free world, if I can actually say that rather grandly. But I think it's no accident that University of California, Santa Cruz, Wesleyan University, these kinds of places are having very similar ideas to what takes place at Sussex at roughly the same time. And Asa pulls it all together and makes it happen in a British context. And I think that's a very, very distinctive thing. Even though, of course, Sussex was never an American university and certainly not a liberal arts college. I think when you look at the second half, the actual making Sussex, setting Sussex up, the key distinctive feature is this energy. There's a great moment in Malcolm Chase's chapter when he's talking about the sort of interregnum, the hiatus between Asa announcing that he's going to leave Leeds and start at Sussex, and what Leeds try and do about it. And there's a very plaintive letter from the head of department to the vice-chancellor saying, Asa set all these things going, but now he's gone, and we can't find one person to replace it. We're having to try to drag people in from sort of 13 different departments to actually just recreate that energy that actually Asa brings to things. And I think that that's a really important point. It's not an intellectual contribution really. It's a kind of personality contribution, and I think that gets Sussex off the ground, gets it going, and makes this project actually happen. And shows the other new universities that it can actually be done, that you can actually set up new universities with this mixture of subjects, particularly a big social science sort of heart to the project, that you can educate a much broader range of people, that you can set up the world, as it were, that the Robbins report then comes in and defines. So I think that's what I would say. I mean, there was some interesting, you talked about regionalism as well. And I just don't know about that. I'd love to know what Asa's views on this are, because I mean he is so identified with regionalism. But I don't really sense it in the Sussex project, actually, particularly. I think Sussex has a kind of regional...
Or the OU project, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's partly because Asa is international. He's an inherent internationalist, I think. That might be the title for another book, actually, The Inherent Internationalist. But I think Sussex's relationship with the county and with the town of Brighton are very, very interesting. But then, the county got together to create the university, and that relationship had to be curated very carefully and was very skillfully curated, actually, by Asa for 10 or 15 years after the university's foundation. Now, whether that counts as regionalism or not, I don't know. But I don't know if you have a view on that.
Let me just finish with one question, and Rohan, we might come back to you as a student of Sussex. I was reading just the other day, this is a magazine, the name of which may ring bells for people, called Bias. Yes, the University of Sussex student magazine from the 1960s. In fact, there were several. There was 237, and that was then succeeded by Bias. Then there was some kind of split, and something called Federalist emerged. And then the Wine Press. But there's also, I think, there was always there. Anyway, one student magazine seemed to spawn another. And of course, Asa contributes to the student magazines as well. And in his article in Bias, he says, we wanted to be bold, we wanted to be controversial in setting up the new programs at Sussex. One thing we didn't want to try and shape was the student experience. And I think that really is a hallmark of his attitude towards those tumultuous years, towards the end of the 60s and early 70s. Trust in students, trust in young people. They may not look like they know what they're doing, and they may not want to know what they're doing, but they are the future. And Asa doesn't say much in the House of Lords since his ennoblement, but there's a wonderful speech he makes about the defence of free speech in the universities and the importance of freedom of speech in the universities. And I think it's something that there might well be another chapter about, but I think it was enormously important that this university had a pragmatic liberal vice-chancellor during those years, so pragmatic and liberal that he was called in to troubleshoot other universities such as Stirling, which went through some problems involving royal visits and the such like. Rohan, is there anything you want to add as a student of Sussex, obviously at a later stage, which speaks to that?
Yeah, well, I came here in 1979, so after Asa left, and I still remember, though, there was this curious kind of nostalgia, though. I mean, Asa's shadow still was upon the university. You really felt this still was Asa Briggs's university. And when there were conflicts between the Students' Union and the management, which there were all the time, there was this kind of nostalgic mode of bring back Asa Briggs, who seemed to have that ability, we were told, in the folklore, to actually understand where students were coming from, and to address their kinds of problems. And it was clear. I mean, I always tell my own students that I can talk about with authority about the 1960s because I went to the University of Sussex, and the 1960s, the swing 60s, were going on at this university till at least 1984, as far as I can work out. So in one sense, I can say I was there, but there was a feeling that to be a Sussex student, you really felt you really were it, because this was a place, unlike any other university, where you could flourish, you could ask the sort of difficult questions, you could change your own identity. I know this. I'm sure lots of people at other universities would feel like this, and yet we had this incredible pride of being at Sussex, that we were somehow different. And I'm afraid that I can bore about Sussex forever. I won't do so now. But even now, I tell other people I'm different because I went to Sussex University, and I expect people to know what I mean.
Thank you. Asa, the last word on this occasion.
Well, first of all, the adjectives that you use or don't use are terribly important. And an adjective which I used a lot in the 1950s and 60s was exciting. People must have got tired of my using the word exciting. The other thing that I would like to say just in conclusion is that when I referred to my family in my life, I don't think that any of the things that I was doing got in the way of my family. And in particular, my wife. And she was the one who had to put up with more with me than anybody else has ever done, and still does.
So the discussions can continue over lunch, and there will be some book signing as well. We hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day as much as we've enjoyed it all so far. Thank you all for coming.